So our final panel will be the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on research, development, and regulatory review of medical products for other indications and what's been happening. So for that, I welcome Jennifer Cochran and Andy Plump. So the two of you, take it away.
Thank you very much, Laura. Jeff, thank you very much for those wise words. Jennifer, hello. Look forward to spending the next 70 minutes with you and an incredibly esteemed panel that I know you'll introduce in just a second. Perhaps I can offer just some introductory comments before we jump into the panel. 2020 has just been an amazing year. And if we look at what came before 2020, we had a half decade of just phenomenal innovation. We saw really the birth of living therapies, cell and gene therapies that offer the promise for not just treating disease, but for curing disease. We saw advances in target identification through human genetics and broadly across the modalities that we use, including sophisticated recombinant proteins. And the progress was palpable. When we entered into 2020, I think all of us were just excited to see that momentum continue. And then boom, March came. And with March came this pandemic, and it was the Wild West. It was really chaotic. And I don't think any of us knew what was going to happen. But I would say unequivocally, the ecosystem stepped up and we scored. And if you look at 2020 now in retroscope, you look at statistics like FDA approved somewhere between 53 and 58 novel medicines, depending on how you count, which would put it at number 1 or number 2 in history. A really amazing year in terms of our ability to respond to the pandemic. Neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, as you'll hear from George Yancopoulos, vaccines, our ability to unravel the biology of this novel virus just in a nanosecond. Really an amazing year. And I think we've also learned a lot. We've learned that we could do things differently. And we've learned that maybe you go through an event that's as disruptive and a crisis like we just went through, and there are silver linings that can come out of it. And so the intent of this panel, and I'll hand it over to you, Jennifer, in just a second, is to really take a deep dive into what some of those learnings are from the past year and what we can expect in the coming years. So Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm honored to co-chair this panel with you today. And I also wanted to start by thanking our panelists for their time and participation, and to thank the organizers for bringing us together for what's been a remarkable day. And I'll start out by seconding what Andy has said and just add that in addition to the unprecedented development of drugs and vaccines in 2020, we've also really seen an unprecedented surge in healthcare and VC investments across all sectors. So biopharma, health tech, diagnostics and tools, and also devices. And so maybe we could all agree that this trend would have been realized without the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, just due to the growing needs and interests in these areas that have been building over the past few years. But I think we can all also agree that it's being buoyed by COVID-19 related activities, owing to the fact that many venture-backed diagnostics and tools companies and biopharma companies have been using their technologies, as we've heard today, to develop COVID tests and treatments. Looking forward, however, what I would like for us to discuss on the panel today is that we perhaps have a perfect storm that's been brewing, with R&D efforts and clinical trials that have been paused or delayed due to COVID, along with the new investments I just mentioned in technologies that will be moving towards or already entering the clinic. And so I think we have a great opportunity at this point for reflection to think about how we want to drive change moving forward. So as Andy mentioned in this panel, we really want to be acknowledging the past year, but also forward-looking on what we hope is a silver lining to the pandemic around how we take all the learnings from the past year and use them to really accelerate and reduce cost and burden of both R&D and also clinical development. So with that, I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panelists for this session. So we have Hal Barron, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at GlaxoSmithKline. We have Patrizia Cavazzoni, who's the Acting Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. We have Mathai Mammen, who's the Global Head of Research and Development at Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. We have Clive, Meanwell, who's the Executive Chairman of Population Health Partners. And rounding out the group, we have George Yancopoulos, who's co-founder, president, and chief scientific officer at Regeneron. So before we jump into things, a few words about housekeeping. We're going to start off with an intro lightning round of a question that I'll ask all the panelists, and then I'll lead a discussion around some timely questions. Andy will then field Q&A with the audience. So please, as the session is occurring, enter your questions in the chat as we go along so we can tee those up for Andy in a little while. So the first question I want to start out with, and this is meant to just have a brief introduction and summary from the panelists, are prior to the pandemic, what do you feel in your different organizations was working really well and what was not working so well, and either from an R&D point of view or how clinical trials were being run, depending on what your area of focus is. So let's go down the line with just a short lightning round answer to kick us off. So Hal, why don't you start, and then we'll have Patrizia follow.
Okay, thanks, and great to be here. What's going well? Well, I think you both hit on it from my perspective earlier. Science and technology has never been more impressive in the world, and I think the pandemic highlighted that. But basically, with science and technology, our industry is solving the big problems facing society, and I think that was well on its way prior to COVID. COVID clearly accelerated that, some of the mRNA technologies, et cetera. But I think we're at unprecedented times in being able to develop targets, therapies, new modalities to target unmet medical needs.
I will speak from the regulatory perspective and from the perspective of what we do at CEDAR prior to the pandemic. I think that when we look at the regulatory pathways and that we have at our disposal, and the way we do our work, I think things were, going pretty well. It's I think that they have both served us well in a pre-pandemic world. They obviously did not serve us as well during the pandemic, and but that's for later in the panel.
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Andy. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I think there's it's almost obvious that there is lots and lots and lots of room for improvement, and we'll get a chance to talk through some of what that is. I'd like to agree with Hal that despite everything, despite COVID, it's amazing the progression of programs across the board. We had some of the first illustrations of real utility across new modalities. We had new diseases entered into. And it required heroic effort. It did in our company, and I know it did in other companies. So it's a hat off really to the industry and to the regulators and to all those partners that kind of made it all happen. With our company in particular, each program we formed a war room of sorts, and we had a breakdown through a data-driven approach. As data was coming in, we could see what the issues were from all our data sources, and we were able to figure it out. And some of the new methods and approaches we put into place, that's what I'm hoping we can talk about here, and some of what hoping we can cement. I know FDA and other regulatory bodies were quite accommodating during COVID, but I'm hoping that we internally and regulators will be able and willing to cement the best of these changes going forward.
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out, as did Patrizia, for progress on the regulatory side. I think that the International Conference on Harmonization has been a controversial movement from time to time, but some of us are old enough to remember when it started in 1993, and I think the progress that's been made is astonishing in that time, and it's continued. In fact, we saw this year, even in the middle of the pandemic, the formalization of the addendum to ICH E9, which I think will change our language for how we think about creating evidence for clinical decision-making. So I'd like to say that to me was going very well, continued to go well, and even went well through the time of the pandemic. So more needed. It's never enough, but excellent progress.
And we'll finish off our lightning round with George.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Hi to everyone. Echo some of the thoughts that came already from the other panelists. I do think that we all felt like we were on the dawn of a new era in terms of drug discovery and drug development before 2020. And I think, as Mathai said, in terms of the response to the pandemic, everything that we were doing internally, kudos to our people, but I think everybody throughout the industry, how everybody throughout the whole ecosystem stepped forward and were working 24/7, devoting themselves to coming up with answers and solutions and going forward. But the thing that I saw that most highlights to me what we were doing differently beforehand and what's been happening now during the pandemic. And I don't know whether we even realized how different things were before the pandemic. It is really, I can't say enough about the FDA. Like I said, our people were working 24/7 on weekends, whatever they could do. But there was total reciprocation on the side from the FDA. They were working themselves 24/7 on weekends, midnights on weekends. Okay, giving informal feedback immediately, turning timeline turnarounds that normally take weeks or months to days, rolling submissions, incredible degree of urgency. So I don't know whether we can remember how it was before COVID, realize what's been happening under this pandemic, but how the world came together, and particularly also how the FDA really stepped up their game, their level of urgency. I mean, I for sure have no idea whether they can possibly maintain this degree of effort and urgency throughout all of their divisions and therapeutic areas and across everything. But we saw if the FDA was sufficiently resourced and driven, how we could really just change timelines and really work hand in hand to really help drive and move progress so much more quickly than what we were used to before the pandemic.
Thanks, George. And I think we'll kick off the nitty gritty with yourself. So this is not exclusively a panel on COVID. And so what would be great to learn about is just some of the other things in your pipeline, like what happened with that, and what things were slowed. Has it slowed? You know, how are you managing that? So we'll start with George, and then we'll go to Mathai for his comments.
Well, I do have to say, I'm sure like all of us, when we saw the future, I mean, so many of us across all of our organizations, you know, either working together or what we're doing internally, we recognize that there might be a challenge to mankind unlike any that we had ever seen. And like I said, I think everybody sort of came together. But I have to admit that the impact on our operations, and particularly our clinical trial operations and so forth, frankly, were much less than I had actually feared. And a lot of the credit goes to, the people in the organization who really planned well and dealt with things. But along the ways, there were delays everywhere, delays of a quarter here. Early on, I mean, we paused initiating new sites into trials because we imagined how great the impact could be. And we were trying to at least keep the ongoing trials, the ongoing sites going as much as possible. In some cases, we paused entire regions. I know on the outside, a lot of the sites that we would normally use, a lot of the first in human healthy volunteer sites were completely shut down. But what we started realizing was for a lot of our trials, and a lot of our treatments, patients were coming in. They were coming in for their visits. I mean, these were cancer patients. The patients themselves recognized how important, the opportunity could be to participate in the trials, and their physicians were equally motivated and working hard. And so because of the critical natures of so many of the diseases and the treatments that many of the patients were receiving, the doctors and the patients and the institutes rose to the challenge. I mean, we have to recognize that resources at the sites in many cases were reduced and often diverted due to the COVID situation. We often had much more limited access to sites. Once again, I think the FDA incredibly stepped up. I mean, what were major changes was the FDA embraced the notion of remote monitoring of sites, which was a really big deal for us. And I think the world was coming to this point with the increased use of electronic record and so forth, but the implementation of intelligent remote monitoring systems is what we were employing, what the FDA was embracing, allowed us to deal with a lot of things. Normally we dealt with sending people to sites and so forth. We couldn't operate that way. And we work with regulators to come up with new ways. So like I said, it's hard to say, in the background of this pandemic that, I fear things could have been much, much, much worse in terms of how everything could have been affected. And I'm impressed with both how all of our people, how all the physicians and the patients at the site stepped up, and of course, how the regulators were true partners in helping deal with everything and coming up with new solutions such as remote monitoring and so forth to help move things along.
Thank you. How about you, Mathai? What was happening at your organization during all of this?
Yeah, fun times at our organization too. We had I'll break it down into development and research. In development, we have more than 400 ongoing trials. That was in March of 2020. We ended up fully pausing 7 of them, only 7. And this was in the areas of pulmonary hypertension and certain novel immune therapies, where for different reasons. The pulmonary hypertension is because pulmonologists were absolutely critical to those trials, and they were almost without exception pulled into taking care of COVID patients. So there wasn't so much the trial itself that was problematic. It was the treating physicians, the physicians basically that would be critical for continuation. So those took a hit initially, and the immunology, a couple of the immunology trials, especially where there was like high levels of uncertainty on what the degree of immunosuppression would be, or potential exposure to COVID, or worsening the outcome if one got COVID. So these were reasons why 7 of these trials were paused. But I have to say the good news is that means 393 plus were not paused. And they were continued in different ways. So with each of them, like I alluded to before, there were different challenges. Sometimes it was about the physician. Sometimes I'm trying to use examples here. Like, so with oncology trials, it's as George mentioned, there's a high degree of urgency with all involved, whether you're the patient with cancer or to those that are administering potentially life-saving drug. Some of the patients we're studying are really end of the line. Like they really need potential for this therapy, or else really bad outcomes would happen. In other cases, the challenges are different. Like, for example, our esketamine trial. So esketamine is a drug we're studying for treatment of severe depression. And many of the patients, because of what we're studying, we allowed patients in the trial that were potentially, they would have suicidal ideation, and there was potential for attempts of suicide. So this is a very high unmet need. The patients themselves weren't like cancer patients that way, in that there wasn't necessarily the same degree and sense of urgency that they needed to take trips into sites. So what we ended up doing there is remote delivery of drug product, and it had to be done in a way through regulators that was appropriate. So we had changes in the protocol that were approved within a day or two, and it's unprecedented speed. We ended up delivering both the medicine and an iPad to the patient, and there was a monitored administration, and sort of staying with them during the couple hours actually, that we were required to for monitoring post administration of drug. Those are a couple really good examples, I think, of things were done. We used, as I alluded to before, also just a stream of data. We'd always had these, and we've always planned on using them in good ways. But here, whether it was a patient's visit or missed visit potentially, or the treatment administration and recording of that, we were extremely happy that we put in place all the data flow so that we can see exactly what was going on within each of our trials and know exactly, therefore, what to do to correct for or mitigate for whatever slowdown or risk we were seeing. It happened across the board. So things that were going particularly well is home health nursing, direct shipments of drug product, use of telemedicine, which all of us on this panel would want to do. It just came into reality in a sort of forcing function way. It just happened. I think remote monitoring, and George mentioned this, but remote monitoring of sites, site initiation visits remotely, these were things that we'd imagine were possible. Investigator meetings remotely. I mean, I've been part of many of these where you think that the value of getting together in person is so important, but COVID's proof that not so much. Like, you could do this stuff in a far more time and cost efficient manner. So, what else? I think that the partnerships we had with our partner companies like Covance, IQVIA, they changed in their tenor, and we were asking different things of our partners, and our partners needed different things of us. So there too, those relationships changed. And I just have to, maybe I'll stop with what was so good within FDA. So, I'm continue to be in the center of it with the COVID vaccine. And I am blown away and impressed by the degree of commitment and the timely turnaround for everything, thoughtful responses within hours. And this is something that tells us that this crisis, whether to deal with the therapeutics and vaccines that we're trying to create, or with driven by the sense of mission that the industry feels because it's working on important therapeutics and vaccines for many diseases outside of COVID, caused us to come together. And so I'm just really happy about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are really impressive examples that you and George have shared. I'm wondering from folks on the panel, do you think that the pandemic has the same effect on maybe smaller startup companies and biotechs? Because obviously you guys have kept a lot of things running in your organizations. How do you think the smaller companies have fared during this time? Would they have similar stories to share? And feel free if someone wants to offer a thought on that.
I can jump in if you'd like, not as an example of a smaller company, but one of the themes you're hearing, I think, from both George and Mathai and others is the unprecedented amount of collaboration, obviously, between pharma and the FDA, which was, I want to highlight, very impressive. But it was also between pharma and pharma, and we can get into that in a second, but the example I'll use is pharma and biotech. And we ended up doing a collaboration with Vir, George Scangos, which was interesting in that we realized quickly that both of us would be more successful joining together. And from the phone call from George to myself to the press release announcing the deal was 19 days. And during that 19 days, we did all of the due diligence on each other, board meetings, et cetera, contracts, and never met. It was all virtual. And so I think it's an example of another type of collaboration and an example of pace that is, in my experience, unprecedented. And there's other examples like that I can go into, but I think the biotechs experienced the same challenges, maybe magnified because the lack of resources maybe to solve some of these. But I think reaching out to pharma and forming collaborations, not just with the FDA, but with big pharma and other biotechs for that matter, to enable their great science to mature, happened at an unprecedented rate as well.
Jennifer, I'd like to build on Hal's point, because I think for small companies, many that we're invested in or have invested in, there have been greater challenges because, putting my old regulatory affairs hat on from a big company like Roche, not being able to call a colleague in Japan or in China or in Brazil and work through a local regulatory problem that it impacts a global effort, it really does put the smaller companies at a time of a little bit of ascendant sovereignty into trouble. I'm aware of stories of countries not releasing permissions for clinical trials, not releasing drug, for clinical trial supplies, which may well have been to do with an overwhelming amount of paper on the regulator's desk, but could have been a little bit more politically motivated. And if you're at Hal's company or Mathai's or big firms, I think you can solve that a lot more easily than if you're a small company based in Cambridge, or whether that's UK or US Cambridge, and trying to figure it out for yourself. So I think a bit of a disadvantage when you look at the politicization of the R&D process that has crept in here and there for obvious reasons.
Thank you for that. And maybe shifting gears just slightly and talking about R&D. So I was wondering if perhaps Hal, you, and then maybe Andy, you could chime in on, what's been working really well for your R&D pipelines. So, preclinical trials, has that been affected at all? What's should we be expecting from those types of things in the future? So perhaps we'll start with Hal, and then Andy, I know you're a co-chair, but I thought it'd be great to get your thoughts from Takeda as well.
Well, from the preclinical perspective, I think a couple things were interesting. First of all, before the pandemic, our focus had been much like George's and a few other companies on genetics. We were particularly focused on functional genomics, trying to understand the functional aspects of these genetic variants, working with 23andMe and FinGen, UK Biobank, a number of open targets, a number of different groups to essentially try to find targets that had a higher probability of success. And with the enormous amount of data being generated from these trials using machine learning to try to deconstruct the deep semantic relationships that are inherent in some of this genetic data, the highly dimensional nature of it. And what was interesting about the pandemic is that so much of this can be done in silico and modeled that people who couldn't in the beginning anyway get back into the lab were spending a lot more time doing analyses of in silico research, essentially. And so that actually, in a sort of odd way, was sped up and accelerated during the pandemic, which was terrific. And of course, we needed back to some of the biology and basic science, but that was an interesting upside. I think that technology, that focus on genetics and functional genomics and machine learning is going to continue to progress in ways that I think are going to be profound and allow us to have targets that don't have this current probability of success rate of around 10%. It's pretty sad to think that something entering the clinical has a 90% chance of at some point failing, and solving that, I think, is a big thing for industry. So that's an area that I think is exciting to us.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of points to add on to what Hal said, Jennifer. The first is I was blown away at how rapidly WuXi, just to name a company, came back on board. By the time we were shutting down in March, feels like a decade ago, China was coming back full steam, and WuXi was back almost 100%, working multiple shifts. And so for a lot of our small molecule chemistry programs, we didn't skip a beat because we were able to outsource to WuXi. None of our scientists were really in the lab at that point. So I think that was a real dynamic that was quite interesting. The second, which was very specific to COVID, was the types of partnerships that we formed with another number of large pharma companies. Hal had commented on this, that they were not just pharma biotech, pharma regulatory, but pharma interactions. We had engagements with Gilead and Novartis, just to name a couple, where we were sharing chemical matter, trying to advance antivirals for SARS-CoV-2 specific targets in ways that we've never worked together in an open innovation context. So those are two examples. I will say that, just getting back to the conversation on development, I was also amazed at how much we were able to do. I think when we looked at, how readily we were able to adapt, it was just incredible. But we also lost time. I mean, let's be realistic. And some of our programs are now 6 or 7 months delayed, particularly programs that, Mathai, you mentioned this in immunology, where you just couldn't go in with immunosuppressants, let's say, and feel comfortable treating patients. We had an agent that was being used to treat CMV and post bone marrow transplant, and bone marrow transplants weren't happening. And so there were a lot of programs where we actually did lose time. And then the last comment I'll make that is interesting, and I'm curious how others think about this, is it's incredible how well we worked virtually. Blown away. I mean, you mentioned this. I can't remember who mentioned it, but one of you who spoke mentioned this. I'm a little bit anxious as we start to come back, because working fully face-to-face is great. Working fully virtually is great. I'm concerned as we start to get into hybrid models where you have, half the people in the room and half the people on the phone, how that's going to work, because historically that's not been that effective of an environment for good communication.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that point, but first I wanted to echo and agree with some of the points that Hal and Mathai and now also Andy said about the collaboration spirit and so forth. We like to still think of ourselves as a small biotech company, and we were able to, just like Hal said, we were the Vir to Roche's big pharma partnership type of a relationship as Vir had with GSK. And it's the same sort of thing in terms of both sides. We're so motivated to come together in ways not only to do the due diligence, but to transfer our processes for manufacturing in weeks instead of something that usually, you estimate is going to take a year or something. It really was astounding. And I do agree with some of these thoughts that it is impressive how much was able to go forward and how many things can be done virtually, and maybe you don't have to hold up and have meetings and so forth. But there's a big but to it. Okay, I do think that the foundation of our industry and the foundations that in everything that we do is in the early stages. What we're talking about here is these latter stage processes of drug development and the downstream processes. I have been involved in countless like this Zoom meetings. Okay, I'm sorry, it does not replace face-to-face interactions. Okay, and that is where true brainstorming, true like genius ideas come together and so forth. And if you are going to be dependent on humans working together to develop great ideas, which is where I think, at least all of the great stories at Regeneron ever came from, a bunch of people in the room arguing it out, debating and so forth, that just cannot work optimally. I'm sorry, these technologies can never replace that. And so we have to recognize that though there's a lot that can happen, it's amazing how much has happened. I think that it's for the parts of these processes that require less of that special spark that happens in real human interactions, people in a room. And I pray and I hope that we get back to that, because without that, that's going to put, I think, I don't think human, true ingenuity and brainstorming in groups can ever happen using these remote approaches. And so at least that's my point of view.
Actually, can I jump in on that? Because I too, I didn't comment on discovery yet, and let me just take a second to do that. We did manage to continue lab work. We did it in shifts, and we had very specific ways of doing that. And but I went into the labs multiple times during the pandemic, and it's different, and I don't think it's sustainable the way we're doing it right now, for reasons that George just alluded to, plus others, like the others first. When you run labs very sparsely, as it is, compared to 25 years ago to now, there are fewer people per lab, partly because of the amount of instrumentation and automation that actually happens. It's sparse anyway. And when you add COVID to that, you could go into lab like half a day and not really see anybody. And the psychological impact of that, we have to think about a little bit too. And or it was so sparse that you'd run into fewer people than you normally would. And, so for certain personality types, that's not terribly healthy. Second is, as George said, there's for discussing things of tremendous uncertainty, where you take personal risk, when you state an idea, and your body language and how it's received is really important. This is like the ideation stage. It's designing an experiment to test a hypothesis. It's hard stuff from an interpersonal standpoint. And I agree completely with George. I don't think it works nearly as well, like through Zoom, as it is when you're standing there and you can sit and you can be emotional and you can stand up again, and all the things that go into great ideas. I think so far, at least, maybe I'm getting old-fashioned somehow, but I do think it requires a face-to-face interaction. So we'll have to figure this out with time, and we shouldn't overreact to the success of being remote, that we just somehow cement that, and for at least the scientific discussions that George is alluding to.
Well said.
Thank you for that. I want to put everything we've heard today and also at this panel. What do you think are some mitigating efforts that could be sustainably built into future research and development and also clinical development to enhance efficacy, cost, and time? Patrizia, we'll have you go first.
Listen, I think that there is a lot that I hope that we have learned through the during the pandemic as we adapted to development and R&D to all these constraints, and that we should be able to retain in the post-pandemic world. I think we have to. It would be a real shame if we just went back to the way things used to be done. From a regulatory perspective, thinking at the risk of sounding like Jeff Shuren, regulatory agility is something that I hope we will be able to retain and advance. Obviously, we have had an unprecedented amount of flexibility because we were able to, under the declaration of emergency, to be more agile. We have EUAs, or emergency use authorization pathways, and so on. Having said so, there are things that I should continue to be the standard of practice. I think that, George, you mentioned risk-based monitoring. Look, we had been talking about risk-based monitoring for years, and it was not gaining any traction, or not as much traction as we would have liked. And are we going to go back to having 2,000 monitors flying all over the country? No, I hope not. Decentralized clinical trials. I mean, we heard some examples, the example of esketamine from Mathai, the leveraging technology to a greater extent, and digital tools, and et cetera. I hope that these will remain with us, and it is very much, we're very interested and very committed actually to continue to advance these modalities. And from our perspective also, what we have learned, and I would like to see continue, is greater agility in not only responding obviously to sponsors as part of review of programs. So we have heard some examples earlier, but also in our ability to issue guidance, to issue advice. Think about what we did in the very early, but in the April timeframe, we very quickly issued a guidance on conduct of clinical trials, exactly because we realized that industry and the R&D apparatus was going to encounter some difficulties, and usually takes us months and months and months to write a guidance. We did it within a matter of a couple of weeks. Not only that, but we now have 250 Q&As added to that guidance. So whenever we learn something, whenever we heard something from a sponsor, we actually reflected in the guidance by adding a Q&A, by modifying things, and et cetera. And I hope that sort of dynamic approach also to issuing guidance, and more agile approach will remain with us as well.
Thanks for those comments. How about you, Clive?
Well, I like the thought that we could continue getting experience on risk-based monitoring, but I worry because I think it's an enormous financial driver. In this case, it would improve costs. and it also improves quality. But I worry that the structure of our clinical trial industry is such that we still will pay people on activities like we do our law firms, and therefore there's more incentive to do more activities than to do smart activities. So I think we got to fix that, and I'm hoping the big CROs who did such a fantastic job here will start to think about how they can be rewarded without making us pay for activities which aren't actually adding anything to quality. So that's a challenge for both the drug industry, the drug companies, biotech companies, and the CROs. I think we're going to do that. The other thing that I like about what happened this year is we all got to witness the power of large numbers. Obviously, the vaccines performed considerably better than most, certainly I expected. And those trials were powered for less effect size. But I think we all got a lesson in statistical power this year. And even in those trials, there were substantial amounts of data in subgroups that gave us the reassurance that racial groups and ethnic groups and genders could be adequately covered by these vaccines. So I think it reminded us all that bigger is better in clinical trials by and large, and that therefore demands greater efficiency in order to be able to afford them. So I thought that was good, and hopefully all our statisticians and data science experts will feel good about that and feel empowered so that their voice is strong in development teams. I think we tend to still towards the medical voice rather than the science and data science voice in our multidisciplinary teams. I think this should empower those guys to play their leadership role as they have done for the vaccines.
Can I pick up on that, Clive? Because you said something that's very, definitely resonates with me. I think, let me use the example of picking sites for clinical trials. I think if you went and asked people outside of our industry and described the process, they would think we'd use data anyway. But it's amazing to me how much just anecdote and relationships and so forth goes into picking clinical trial sites, as an example. And one of the things like we did, for example, for COVID-19's vaccine, is it was a highly data intensive approach. We constructed a model with collaborators at MIT using machine learning model to predict where the pandemic was ebbing and flowing and waxing, waning. So this was something that was a very sophisticated and valid model that we used to train. And we went right to the peaks of where we believed we needed to be during the event collection periods in our trial. And we were proved right. So that was like a really good example. But it had nothing to do with all the methods that were more anecdotal or less data intensive. And Clive, you said it exactly. It puts data scientists and the clinicians on equal footing when this kind of thing happens. And that's one of the silver linings I'd like to sort of keep going forward. Because we talked about some of the operational advantages and tricks and cementing of certain things. And I think that will definitely say, but the big ticket items that will fundamentally change, the efficiency and effectiveness of doing drug discovery and development, lie within use of data and analytics in a very good way. Clive's example with inclisiran still stands high in an amazing methodology of running a trial entirely within a healthcare system. But these are methods, whether it's big ticket items like picking sites and, instead of taking 2 years, maybe you take 6 months to ultimately recruit if you can do that very well. We've all talked about external control arms. George, I heard you on a panel before. This is hard stuff. And in certain areas, we're going to be able to figure it out. Other areas, a little further away, but we need to try. The recruiting process even and how to go about doing that. We learned a little bit with the vaccine trial, what works and what doesn't, using real-time kind of feedback of methodologies that we were putting in place. Again, you'd think that we would have been doing that all this time, but this crisis is what actually now made us rapidly evolve, and now we want to apply this across all our trials.
What was the feedback mechanism? How did you know what you're doing was actually making a difference, Mathai? You know
Yeah,
that whenever we institute new technology, innovative ways of working, you take a dip typically in productivity and effectiveness before you actually step up.
I know, like for the specifically what I'm referring to is to improve ethnic diversity and racial diversity in our vaccine trial. It was a big challenge. So we had put out multiple methodologies. We did local testing, like in certain regions of certain methodologies. We were quick to respond to them and apply what we did broadly, and we were able to get a very diverse trial as a result. And I know that companies have struggled with this, especially for this particular vaccine program. One other thing we did, just as very important, is the concept of tokenizing our trial in vaccines again. And that was a big lift. It was a big lift for us internally because we had to figure out how to do it. What it is, first of all, is it's connecting the clinical trial record to the electronic health record of a participant if they opt to do that. But how to go about actually doing that, the mechanics that maintained privacy and appropriateness of what we were doing, and all of that was not trivial at all. We had to go through a big learning curve. We did it. Our partners in IQVIA went through that learning curve with us. They did it, and the sites are now doing it. Confusion about what it means, fixing misinformation, but I see tokenizing data, like tokenizing trials like this, and being able to connect to electronic health records as something that is very important, probably for all of us here going forward.
Thanks so much. I want to turn it to Andy to take some audience questions, but before I do, I really want to ask Hal a quick question about, we've been talking a lot about the government, the FDA, industry, biopharma. How can academia be involved in these activities? What role do we play? And I feel like as the academic on the panel, I really want to ask that to the panelists. What role can our groups have?
Well, the role academia plays is enormous. I think that this has been another highlight of COVID in some respects. Again, the collaborations that I think all of us, I won't speak for everybody, but I think most of us had to both get information from, to find out the strengths and that we had it internally, but the areas that we needed help with, whether we then went to biotech or pharma companies to help, or academia. We, during this pandemic, and we just announced it last month, formed I think what will be a very, very important and fruitful collaboration with the Broad on functional genomics and machine learning and human genetics. Those are kinds of things that are I think going to be more common, particularly in some of the earlier panels that we had today, talking about new models in academia that can facilitate that. But I just see the collaboration, which frankly I think has been very, very strong during COVID. I think the world sometimes misses the collaboration between all of us, academia, industry, government. I think was pretty good before COVID. It was definitely improved, and I think it was sometimes lost that people didn't see it. But I've seen so many collaborations between academia and industry go exceptionally well. I'll just throw out one tiny point that I've seen over 20 whatever years it's been of doing this, is that when I've worked with academia, where the academics feel very lucky to be collaborating with us, and we feel very lucky to be collaborating with them, it works great. And when one group if industry sees academia as a place to get patents, or academia sees industry a place to get money, where it's very, it's not a symmetric relationship that way, they don't tend to work out. They start okay, but they don't tend to work out that well. And I think that holds true for pharma collaborations, biotech pharma collaborations, basically any collaboration in life, whether it has to do with work or not. When both parties feel very lucky, it works out really well. And so I think it's finding the partner who genuinely values what you're bringing to the table. And I've been in many discussions, one in particular that was challenging for me, where I didn't think the other party really valued what we were bringing to the table. And as much as I loved the idea of working with them, I said, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think you are going to be excited enough to work with us. We'll be very excited to work with you, but ultimately that'll be too asymmetric. So I think that would be the one thing. Find the company who you feel lucky if they say yes, and where that company says the same thing back.
Andy, I'll turn it over to you to take some questions from the audience.
Thanks, Jen.
I see we have some in the chat.
I have to react. I love your answer, Hal. It's reminding me of a story about 10 or 15 years ago. I've sat on the board of a not-for-profit that funds biomedical research in the cardiovascular space called the Sarnoff Cardiovascular Research Society. And I was at a dinner, again, 10 or 15 years ago, and hosting the new fellows. And I was speaking to a young budding cardiologist who had just gotten a year for a grant from us to do some research. And she asked what I did. And I said, I was at Merck at the time. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, thank you very much for hosting this dinner." So my value proposition was hosting the dinner. So I agree with you fully. There needs to be a mutually beneficial win-win relationship. So there are some questions coming on Slido. We'll try to go quickly through questions. I would encourage anybody in the audience that has interesting questions for this panel to upload them with a name. We prefer names to anonymity. But I'm going to start with my own Slido question. And Patrizia, it's for you. So there's a love affair that we've heard between this entire panel, myself included, and FDA. And I would suggest it's not just what's happened during COVID, it's the progressive.
At the tone, please record your message. When you have finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Well, you're being recorded, Patrizia, so make this answer really good. There's this love affair that we all recognize, and it's gone on before COVID. Quality. We have to recognize also that there are perhaps things that aren't working. And I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the challenges that we continue to face at FDA? And what are some of the things that came out over the last year you think that we can continue to work on?
So, as you said in the introduction, we had a very good year if we look at the non-COVID related work. The Office of New Drugs had an almost a record year when it comes to NDAs and so on. I think that we can reasonably expect that we may see the pace maybe of non-COVID work not being as high next year when it comes to NDAs, because what we heard in this panel is that we probably have still to see the impact of the delay of some clinical trials, at least in some therapeutic areas. So there may be some therapeutic areas that may not be as sort of a productive next year. I think that what we are seeing, within CEDAR are really, challenges when it comes to deployment of our resources. We have done really well, I think, over the past year. I mean, obviously, nothing is perfect, but given the unbelievable incremental work that we had this past year, we were able to, move people around. We were able to actually have people from one division go and work in another division, which was pretty much unprecedented, right? We're not necessarily, we're still a sort of a fairly sort of siloed organizations when it comes to therapeutic areas and so on. I think that despite that, there is more room for that, to have sort of more sort of flexibility in the deployment of our resources. Clearly, we cannot keep up this pace forever. We are obviously working 24/7 to manage this incremental work, but let's not forget that really we haven't had any incremental resources when it comes to the people. And so having said so, I think that we can learn to maybe be more agile in how we sort of not only how we do things, but also how we deploy our reviewer and our scientists. The other challenge for us is the fact that the sheer volume of work, and the fact that we would very much like to be able to respond to everybody in real time or near real time. And the sheer magnitude of the work versus the people that we have to catch it doesn't allow us to do that. And and I think that it would be desirable to be able to do this more if we had the bandwidth to be able to do this work, to be able to do it. Last but not least, I think that there's something that constrains us in the sense that we are first come first serve sort of type of workflow, right? And during the pandemic, we have had to flex a muscle that we didn't quite. It was quite. We hadn't quite flexed in the past, which is really having to determine, how do we prioritize certain things? How do we prioritize work? And also, how do we tailor our advice to the experience of the company? We had so many companies that in small biotechs that had never developed a drug before, and we had to develop a way to almost sort of walk them through the process of filing an IND. And so I think we have done, well. There is more room to get to a more tailored, fit for purpose approach also of how we work with researchers and sponsors, depending on their experience. So this is another area that I think could continue to be advanced. Last but not least, the challenge for us has always also been to, cut through the noise, all of this noise out there, right? We have spent the past few months with the news about therapeutics and so on every day, sometimes, communications have gotten a little drowned, right, by all that noise around us. And so cutting through the noise as we communicate to the public has been a bit of a challenge.
Great. Well, thank you, Patrizia. So I'm going to go to the Slido board. And Clive, this next question is about healthcare disparity. And I'm going to throw it, I think I could throw it to anybody. It's something we all need to be thinking about, but I hope you don't mind. I'm going to throw this one to you. And the question highlights the fact that the pandemic has smoked out an issue that we've all known about that oftentimes is swept under the rug around healthcare disparities, particularly towards people of color and other underprivileged minorities. And so the question is, what can we do about this, particularly from a regulatory and a clinical development standpoint?
Well, it's a hard one. It's been around forever, as you say, Andy. And I think what has been uncovered at the same time is a distrust factor which goes beyond healthcare. Distrust of, quote unquote, the elites, of which we're all members, unfortunately, or fortunately, on this conference. People who need healthcare don't trust us. Don't trust the government, don't trust Wall Street, and there are a lot of reasons why they shouldn't in their minds. So I think we have to deal with that first. I think that the transparency and the purposefulness of our work is still under suspicion. I think that our industry associations, particularly Bio and PHRMA, continue to give very mixed messages about why we're here. And I think we haven't yet reconciled that. So our focus on rare disease and cancer has frightened a lot of people, has left behind millions and millions of people with common disorders who were really exposed during this pandemic for reasons we all know. So I think as an industry, we've got to look to our laurels and say, with this amount of success, with the kind of biological advances that Hal was referring to, I agree completely with him. I think we have to ask, how do we unpack that biology for common diseases? And how do we find a fundamentally different way of doing studies for those diseases? One area I know all of you have looked at it too, is the patient centricity of some data management firms. I'm going to give a shout out for Harlan Krumholtz and his team at the Hugo and organizations like that are trying to make it a civility issue to get involved with clinical trials so that people can be proud and feel like they really own their data and can participate in trials from out to in. So I think this COVID thing probably has loosened the rocks a little bit for that to happen. And I think we should all, certainly on the industry side and the regulatory side, we should all push hard for that to keep that progress.
It's great. Thanks, Clive. It's like a rubber band. You stretch it, you pull it out at moments like this when the lamppost is shining on it, and then it goes away and it snaps back. It's a recurrent problem. Let's hope that elastic starts to fade and we can really make an impact. So let's go to the next Slido question. And I think Mathai and then maybe George. It's about skill sets that we'll need to develop over time as we start to advance and evolve our approaches to clinical trials. That was what the question was, but it applies to everything that we're doing. So Mathai, as we're starting to do more of what you described in terms of clinical trial decentralization and new ways of looking at analytics for clinical trials, what skill sets do we need to evolve? And there was specifically about what's the role of the CRA, if you want to tackle that one in the future. And then George, maybe you can take that on in whatever way you want. I know you've been a real pioneer in thinking about new ways of innovating in our business.
Can I answer that in a way that connects to the last question in healthcare disparities a little bit? Because there has been for many of us it's been obvious. It's obvious. There's both a trust and a trustworthiness issue that we can deal with those things kind of separately. The socioeconomic factor here in COVID has been really in your face. Because for many of us, as Clive said, all of us here on this call, the ability to respond to COVID by social distancing and by everything that we're doing, virtual working, it's actually possible. Yeah, it's kind of a pain, but it is possible. For many people, it was not possible. It's impossible. And those tended to fall within the lower socioeconomic bands in our world, all our regions. And when it comes to, just to tie it over to the clinical trial question for a moment, when you look at participation in clinical trials, for many of them, many people, many trials, for the participants, it's kind of a time-intensive thing. They have to take time off their work. They have to be able to sometimes travel to a site. They have to, occasionally do things that are very time intensive. If you're struggling economically in your job and you need that, the amount of compensation you get from companies to actually take that time off, it just may not cut it. So then to swing a little bit further, this remote evidence collection and heading, relentlessly, just as much as we can towards siteless trials. The big way is in a system, but the smaller but possible ways is through telemedicine and home collection of even blood products. People have been talking about blood spots for decades, and where is that exactly? Yeah, and this would be a way of enabling people that where time is even more precious. And jobs can't just be left for a day or two to travel to a site. I believe you can connect all the innovations in clinical trial, especially the ones that don't involve subjects coming as frequently to sites, to addressing part of the problem in diversity and socioeconomic diversity in clinical trials. The broadest answer is that, all the skill set question, Andy, that I think was part of the question is asked, one needs to be able to manipulate and be comfortable with data going forward and act on it, follow through on it in a way that might be at odds with how one's been working all this time, might be at odds with old relationships with certain academic centers or certain sites and investigators, and be that much more dispassionate and data-driven in how one does a clinical trial. So that's my little arc from socioeconomic disparities to the value of data science.
Great, thank you, Mathai. George?
Well, I guess the question about how we could really change everything and change the inefficiencies in clinical trial development and design and so forth. I mean, I think it's a really important one. And we touched upon it in a previous panel. I don't know how many participated or listened to panel 2, where this was brought up in the context of real world data and real world trials, which I think everybody agrees we are so far away from. And it also touches upon, we all brought up, or I think it was Mathai or Andy brought up Clive's example with inclisiran and the National Health Service system in the UK. I think that it's almost a disgrace. It's almost criminal that we don't have a national health database. We don't take advantage and we don't rigorously collect all health information. And we can't utilize any such system because it doesn't exist to be able to greatly accelerate our ability to do clinical trials here in the States. I mean, another example of it, many of you, we talk about great collaborations and how we in the industry work together. Many of you on the panel are involved with us in this great consortium to sequence the UK biobank. Why? Because we don't have an American biobank. And, they've been talking about it for years, but we never did it. I think these are great failures for a country that should be the leading country in all these efforts. And I think that the single most important thing that we could do to figure out how to really revolutionize how probably we deliver better care, but also how we collect that data, how we capture that data, how we utilize that data to greatly accelerate and enhance and much more economically do all of our clinical trial development and so forth. And like we said, I mean, what Clive did with inclisiran is a great example. They did a trial for probably, 50 times, less dollars than we did the old-fashioned one, using, random, our standard clinical trial system and so forth. So I really think that that's frankly, the biggest big picture thing. It's a disgrace, I think, that our country hasn't figured out how to do that. We should be leaders in this instead of followers. I think the UK actually, they're not perfect in any way, shape, or form, but at least they've set some examples for us, and whether it's the UK Biobank or whether it's, for example, the inclisiran trial that shows how valuable and how they can greatly accelerate things that we should be doing. And we got to get our act together and really become leaders here.
I think you elicited a smile from our one British panelist. So thank you, George. So listen, we're almost done. I'm going to ask the panelists to real quick lightning, 10 or 15 seconds. What are you most excited about over the next 1 to 3 years coming out of COVID? And Hal, I'm going to start with you.
I think I'm most excited about how we as an industry continue to collaborate, focus on what's best for patients, and ensure everybody understands that science can solve the world's biggest problems. And our reputation, which is down with the tobacco companies, is it all warranted? And I'm looking forward to COVID being a catalyst for the world understanding that we come to work every day to make patients' lives better.
That's great. I'm going to go next to you, Clive, but Jennifer, I want you to be prepared because I'm going to end with you. So Clive.
2 quick things. One, using this amazing unpacking of biology that's been going on in relatively infrequent diseases to apply to prevalent disorders, I think is enormous potential and very exciting. And secondly, restoring the notion that there's a civic honor in being in a clinical trial.
Thank you, Clive. Patrizia.
I think that from the standpoint of what we do, I'm looking forward not to take a step back and to continue to move, to push to be more agile in how we regulate. I'm not talking about changing, lowering the standards, as you heard from Jeff, but the agility and the innovation that we have seen in how we regulate and how we do our work is something that we need to continue, and I'm very excited about that.
Thank you, Patrizia. Mathai.
Yeah, so as you know, Andy, because you're at the center of this, one of the things for me personally that I loved is the collaborative spirit among a whole group of companies, large and small. And I think that created a level of trust that I think leads us to be more apt to do the kinds of things George Yancopoulos mentioned, which are do things that are collaborations that are in that pre-competitive, non-competitive space. There's no reason we can't do things like that. And I think at the foundation of it, the things that prevented that is just a little bit of lack of trust amongst a group of companies. And I think this might be the catalyst that pops us on the other side of the line and enables some of these, whether it's genetics databases or other kinds of things that we can do in the pre-competitive arena.
Great. And the penultimate word to you, George.
Well, I want to just harken back to what Mathai just said, but also what Hal just said. I think the single most important thing that we can do here is change the perception of not only the industry, but our entire ecosystem and science in general. We are on the verge as a ecosystem of delivering and showing the world that we, science, the bioindustry, all the FDA, all of us together can really deliver and make a difference. And why is this so important? We need to resurrect that belief, and also, I guess, that dream that I think so many of us of our generation were drawn into this because we were believers. Those of us who were, children of the JFK generation, so that we believed in science, technology, and that what we could do to elevate this country and our society working all together. And I think we've lost that belief as a nation and as a people. And if we get that back, and this could be a shining example, and I hope we never forget it if we really deliver here, the most important thing about it is we got to engage that next generation of the best and the brightest of the next young minds that are out there to come join us and help us, because we all know the next set of problems that we're going to face are even going to be greater than this pandemic and so forth. So if we can really do that, if we can resurrect our whole ecosystem and the notion of science and people who are working in science as the people who can offer the great solutions for mankind, and we can engage that next generation, then we can get ourselves as a humanity and a society back on track.
Thank you, George. And Jennifer.
I'm just going to amplify and echo what's already been said in terms of bringing together different people, groups from all over the world. I mean, it's been really inspiring over the past year during this very dark time to see how working together, we could all make very rapid progress. And that progress, again, was data and science driven. And so that was very inspiring. I also think it's important to tell good stories. And so back to what was mentioned. And one of the things that we're doing is we actually have on our faculty as an adjunct professor, a staff writer from the New Yorker, so Michael Spector, because I think telling those stories is not only great to get the younger generation, but also get the trust from the general population that's going to be so important for us to be able to make the progress that we want to make. And so, I just want to thank all of the panelists for their inspiring comments and sharing their experiences and stories with us today. It's been a great way to end the conference, I personally think. So thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Wonderful. And thank you very much, Jennifer. It was very fun co-hosting this with you. And I also want to echo Jennifer's comments and thank this incredible panel. It was inspiring and it was meaningful. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much for everything that you do for our healthcare ecosystem. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kathy Giacomini to take us to the next session.